Welcome to the ChinaPower Podcast. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I'm joined by Henrietta Levin and Greg Polling to discuss President Trump's recent trip to Asia and the U.S.-China meeting on the sidelines of APEC. Henrietta is a senior fellow with the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. She previously held senior roles at the U.S. Department of State and the White House, spearheading U.S. strategy and diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. Greg is the Director and Senior Fellow of the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, also here at CSIS. He is a leading expert on the South China Sea disputes and conducts research on U.S. alliances, partnerships, democratization and governance in Southeast Asia, and maritime security issues across the Indo-Pacific. Henrietta and Greg, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
So I'd like to start off with a question to both of you. Looking at the events from last week, what did you find most interesting or surprising from either the ASEAN Summit or the Trump-Xi meeting?
Honestly, the thing that surprised me the most, just to dive into the agenda, was that it appears that the issue of Taiwan was not raised. Now, we don't know for sure because, of course, this was a meeting that happened behind closed doors, but President Trump has been emphatic that cross-strait issues were not discussed. And if you look at the readouts issued by the Chinese government, they also do not mention Taiwan, which is very unusual. Generally, there's a healthy chunk of those readouts affirming that she discussed Taiwan at some length. So it indicates the degree to which the conversation at the leader level has really been reoriented around these economic or tactical considerations rather than the broader strategic ones that previously would have taken up quite a bit of time in any meeting between the U.S. and Chinese leaders. Also, Xi, in every meeting, every Chinese high-level official in every meeting with their U.S. counterparts kind of always raises Taiwan just to lay down a marker of how critically important this is to China. So a bit of a mystery that I think we'll all need to keep reading the tea leaves on as we learn more about this meeting over the coming days and weeks.
Great. Thank you, Henrietta. And we'll definitely follow up on that later in the podcast when we discuss the Trump-Xi meeting in a bit more detail. And Greg, over to you.
For me, it was how well the president's trip was received in most places in the region. And that is admittedly grading on a curve because the biggest concern was either that he wouldn't show up at all, particularly in the context of the ASEAN Summit, or that he would show up and it would go very poorly. And either things happened. So when Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia announced back in July that Donald Trump was coming to the ASEAN Summit with no confirmation from the U.S. side, I thought that was a pretty risky move. Anwar pulled it off. President Trump came, they had positive bilateral meetings. I think they did a very good job of the stagecraft of his visit, letting him oversee a peace deal with Thailand and Cambodia that isn't really a peace deal, letting them put out 4 statements about trade deals and 2 about critical minerals. Only kind of 2 of those 6 actually count as deals. They understand that it's about the pomp and the claims of deals more than it is the substance. And the fact that President Trump did not attend the East Asia Summit. The U.S.-ASEAN Summit was a shadow of what it normally is, and the joint statement was like a page and a half. He did not attend the ASEAN Summit.
And Greg, I think that's a good segue to give a little bit of background of what exactly usually happens during the ASEAN Summit and how many other summits there are. And to your point, which summits does the U.S. president typically attend, and what usually comes out of these types of summits, like in terms of either deliverables or actionable items?
And I'd also turn to Henrietta when I'm done because she's actually had to be involved in making the sausage on these more than once, I imagine. But going back to the Obama administration, when the U.S. started attending the U.S.-ASEAN leaders meeting in, I believe, 2011, along with the East Asia Summit, this is a very big to-do. You get the U.S. leader, whether that's the president or in disappointing years from the ASEAN perspective, the secretary or the vice president, they go, it's at least 3 days. They attend the U.S.-ASEAN leaders meeting, which is one of a series of ASEAN plus ones. There's also a U.S.-China, U.S.-Japan, U.S.-India, U.S.-Korea, et cetera. They attend the East Asia Summit, which is usually the one that caps everything off, and that's the 10 members of ASEAN, now 11 with Timor-Leste's inclusion, plus the 8 major dialogue partners, U.S., China, Russia, et cetera. There's also usually what used to be the Lower Mekong Initiative meeting between the U.S. and the Mekong states. Now it's the Mekong-U.S. Partnership. So there's a ton of these various iterations of multilateral meetings. And each one has a bunch of deliverables that State and the White House would pore over. Normally, we would have gotten like 9-page long fact sheets about all the things that the U.S. is doing in Southeast Asia. We would have had joint statements that came out that were very meticulously negotiated over, like, how do we frame the language about Chinese bad behavior in the South China Sea and freedom of navigation? How do we frame language about the civil war in Myanmar? Literally none of that happened. There was effectively no joint statement for all intents and purposes from the U.S.-ASEAN meeting. There was basically no like State Department fact sheet. He got credit for coming and having fairly productive meetings with the host and with other members, for not browbeating anybody, and then for going to Korea and striking, I think, for what the region views as at least a temporary ceasefire in the U.S.-China trade war, which is good for Asia, right? There was a pretty low bar here to be cleared, and the president cleared it from the perspective of most of Southeast Asia. They basically wanted this trip to first do no harm, and it didn't do any harm, and that's all they were looking for.
And Greg, what meetings did President Trump actually have there? You said he attended, I guess, the celebration of the signing of the Thailand-Cambodia peace deal, of which I think you put in quotes. But did he have any other meetings there?
So the president arrived on Sunday morning in Kuala Lumpur. I believe his first meeting was the Thailand-Cambodia meeting, informal, with Prime Minister Anwar, who rode over with him in the presidential limo. The signing ceremony, as he and Prime Minister Anwar called it, although the Thais and Cambodians say that they didn't sign anything and they just released a joint statement on a meeting they held, was followed by a series of bilateral meetings he had with Prime Minister Anwar, which led to the release of the U.S.-Malaysia trade deal, the actual text, which is the first text that we've gotten, I think, since the UK deal. The critical minerals joint statement with Malaysia, that was followed with bilateral meetings with, I believe, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. Some of those had trade deals, some didn't. Cambodia had a trade deal. All the rest released joint statements. That evening, he joined the ASEAN leaders, so the 11 leaders of ASEAN, for a dinner, which they called the U.S.-ASEAN Summit. That's not usually how the U.S.-ASEAN Summit goes down. And then the next morning, he left and flew to Japan.
And Henrietta, I want to bring you in here. As you look at the president's schedule and the range of activities at the ASEAN Summit, is there anything you want to add in terms of what you found as different, new, or what you found as striking?
Well, just to build on Greg's point briefly, and then I can get into the China piece, I think that the ASEAN countries have always made very clear to the United States that the U.S. president showing up to the U.S.-ASEAN Summit, to the East Asia Summit, is a huge indicator of whether the U.S. is actually serious about its relationships, not just in Southeast Asia, but about its staying power in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. And so I think that's why we're all a little surprised that Trump doesn't just get half credit for, showing up to the location of the East Asia Summit, but not going to the East Asia Summit. This seems to be received by the region really quite well. It's worth noting, just to turn to the China piece, that Xi Jinping never goes to these East Asia summits. It's always the premier. And for whatever reason, the ASEANs consider that full credit for respect and participation in the ASEAN mechanisms, even though, of course, the premier these days is quite far from the actual leader of China in terms of authority anyway. I think that the Chinese delegation really benefited from the way in which the U.S. has been a disruptive presence in the region over the course of this year, even though Trump's personal presence was certainly appreciated. There are huge questions in Southeast Asia about how the United States' reorientation, especially of its international trade policy, is going to affect the long-term growth of Southeast Asia and the fundamental development models in this part of the world. And so China did sign a China-ASEAN Free Trade Area 3.0 upgrade protocol with the ASEAN countries during these meetings. I don't think this is a, revolutionary document, but the fact that it just shows China is committed to continued economic integration, to lowering barriers to market access, that, I think, cuts a sharp contrast with the messaging that the U.S. has brought to the region. And therefore, China may be getting some bonus points for what are, pretty mild and incremental steps for advancing the China-ASEAN relationship.
Bonnie, could I also flag that in addition to China and the U.S., an underreported story here was how many other leaders there were that don't normally go to ASEAN summits. The European Union was formally invited for the first time ever to speak and attend the East Asia Summit. You had guests of Malaysia, including the president of South Africa, Lula from Brazil was there. There was a real undercurrent, a message that ASEAN wanted to send about diversification, that we have options beyond just Washington and Beijing, and here they are knocking down our door to come to our summit.
And from your perspective, were there any major actions or deliverables from the East Asia Summit without the U.S. there? Or I guess without President Trump there?
Yes, so the biggest one for ASEAN, which they deserve credit for, is the accession of Timor-Leste finally as the 11th member. So ASEAN formally grew from 10 to 11 members with this summit. On the economic front, Henrietta highlighted the conclusion of the ASEAN-China 3.0 free trade agreement, which honestly, I don't know anybody who thinks that is a huge deal. It's symbolically important, but the upgrades over the ASEAN-China FTA 2.0 are probably pretty modest. There was also the first summit of all the members of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, since it came into force. And that was, I think, again, another effort to show that there are options for ASEAN beyond the U.S. amid the U.S.-provoked trade war. They announced that they have substantially concluded the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, which is supposed to be an ASEAN-only digital agreement, although it is clearly disappointing that they didn't actually sign it, as people expected this year. They're trying to paper over that. In classic ASEAN fashion, I think there was that and a whole bunch of other things that would bore people. Incremental progress. That is what ASEAN does best. It does incremental progress on intra-ASEAN stuff. It did a lot worse on the part of the mission of being the center of larger Indo-Pacific regionalism.
What is their sense about U.S. attention towards the region, particularly U.S. attention to developments in the South China Sea?
There is a joint statement. It's just a page and a half long, and it doesn't say anything. Is this reiterated, solidified for, I think, all the governments of the region that the administration is not going to be invested, at least not at the leader level, in any form of multilateral institution building in the Indo-Pacific, whether that's ASEAN or APEC or probably the Quad or anything else. But the administration does remain focused on the Indo-Pacific as a region and on individual partners, both economically and in terms of security. So we did have progress, albeit maybe less progress than the press has painted in certain trade relationships. U.S.-Malaysia, U.S.-Cambodia, U.S.-Thailand, U.S.-Vietnam all had announcements. And bigger, I think, critical minerals announcements with Australia and Japan on the sidelines. On the South China Sea, there was nothing from President Trump, and that's not surprising. President Trump has never talked about the South China Sea. I wouldn't expect him to. But Secretary Hegseth is in the region now. He followed the president's trip to attend the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, and he did reiterate the normal U.S. talking points on freedom of navigation, South China Sea. After meeting with Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun, Hegseth said that U.S. positions on the South China Sea and Taiwan are unchanged. It was telling that he said South China Sea before Taiwan, and then he made a series of bilateral announcements with the Philippines, Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam. The most important in the case of the Philippines being the establishment of what's being called Task Force Philippines, although we have relatively little details on what that is, other than that it's supposed to help coordinate U.S.-Philippine cooperation on freedom of navigation. So obviously South China Sea focused.
Henrietta, turning back to you, you had described Chinese participation as headed by Li Qiang. Could you share, aside from Li Qiang's participation in the China-ASEAN Summit, was there anything on his itinerary that you found interesting or surprised you?
I don't know if I saw anything terribly surprising, but I think Li Qiang did take advantage of a moment in which there are real questions about U.S. staying power in the region to paint this narrative of China as the new guardian of the rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific, as China has, attempted to do in other fora in recent months. The countries of Southeast Asia, they know China well. They know what China is. But the contrast between China's message of kind of enduring responsible stability, even though that contrasts so sharply with much of China's actions in the region, the contrast with the message the U.S. is bringing to bear of, wild disruption in the region, I think does provide Li Qiang in this setting and China more broadly with an opportunity they're trying to seize to look like the good guys, like the supporters of these longstanding institutions in the region. I mean, at a time when, to Greg's point, the U.S. doesn't have a lot of appetite for multilateralism, China announced not just the Free Trade Area 3.0 upgrade protocol, but that China will continue to replenish the China-ASEAN Cooperation Fund, that China will work with ASEAN to establish a China-ASEAN digital economy, a China-ASEAN platform for AI cooperation, a China-ASEAN Center for Maritime Development. So, you get the idea, China-ASEAN everything. And in the past, you would have seen this from the US as well, because it is so important to the ASEAN countries that the institution of ASEAN is respected and lifted up, and that the big powers don't only engage bilaterally. And I don't think you've seen as much of that from the US side this year.
And how do you view the meeting that Greg was pointing out earlier between Hegseth and Dongjun? It's been a long time since one of our secretaries of war or defense went to an ASEAN defense ministers meeting and met with the Chinese there.
I think in the past, ADMM Plus, the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, has sometimes been a platform where the U.S. Defense Secretary and the Chinese Defense Minister, depending on kind of the overall context of the relationship, potentially an opportunity for them to speak. I do take issue, admittedly, with part of Secretary Hegseth's readout of that engagement where he celebrates the G2 between the US and China. And that rhetoric he has borrowed from President Trump, but echoing it out of the mouth of one of the most important US defense officials, I think is something that will be quite poorly received in the region. Of course, a G2 being the idea that, the US and China will get together and solve the world's problems, perhaps regardless of what the rest of the world thinks about those solutions. For US allies and partners, especially in the Indo-Pacific, the US is always doing one of two things wrong in its relationship with China. Either the US is being too aggressive, too hawkish, too confrontational, and increasing the risk of a regional conflict that, smaller partners will have to bear the brunt of. So that's one narrative. And I think Greg is right that the region has breathed a bit of a sigh of collective relief, seeing a degree of de-escalation in the US-China relationship coming out of the summit in Korea. But then there's the other complaint, which is that the US and China are too close, that they're going to do a G2, potentially at the expense of US allies and partners. So there's always a burden, a responsibility, I think, for the United States to be proving and demonstrating to its allies and partners that it is doing neither of those things in its relationship with China. It both understands its responsibility to manage the US-China relationship well, avoid inadvertent escalation to conflict, but to also be standing by the common interests and values of the US and its allies in these conversations and not making compromises that would undermine the interests of allies and partners either. And this G2 thing really, I think, will cause some anxiety in that way. That said, I think Secretary Hegseth has been quite effective at the same time at affirming some of the U.S. traditional security commitments in the region, and that has certainly been welcome here. And I think it's particularly important that Hegseth has been so clear and engaged on U.S. interests in the South China Sea, because Trump is not. And to go back to the meeting between Trump and Xi in Korea, I think this is a rare instance of a US-China leaders meeting where South China Sea doesn't seem to have been raised, where, of course, Trump has demonstrated a very strong preference for using that leader channel to focus on more tactical economic considerations. So with the absence of messaging at that very highest level, a lot of responsibility does fall to Hegseth and Rubio to make crystal clear that upholding freedom of navigation, supporting our allies, remain top priorities for the United States in the South China Sea.
To your point, it almost seems like President Trump really wants to focus on building some form of relationship with Chinese leader Xi Jinping and focus on economic issues. And he's delegating all the other issues on the security side to Secretary Hegseth and others on his team.
Yeah, it seems that way. And maybe for that reason, it's also significant that Hegseth announced that there was an agreement between him and Dongjun to expand channels for military to military communication between the US and China. That's always a good thing, in part because the Secretary of Defense channel is quite imperfect because the disparity in responsibility and authority between the US Secretary of Defense and the Chinese Defense Minister has become so stark, where, if Trump wants to look at military options for addressing a crisis, I mean, that's Hegseth. He's the Secretary of War, is the person that the president's going to go to. Whereas currently, I mean, the Chinese defense minister isn't even a state counselor, and he certainly doesn't have a seat on the Central Military Commission. So he's like pretty far from that same level of operational responsibility that the secretary holds. And so if you're trying to kind of address the most difficult, risky, and important issues in the US-China military to military relationship, if you're talking about kind of avoiding downside risk of accidental conflict, like, it's an important channel. They should talk, but it's not the best channel. So hopefully coming out of this meeting, we will see a broader set of conversations between counterparts in the PLA and the US Armed Services.
And just drawing on Hegseth's remarks, he characterized the meeting between President Trump and Xi as a historic G2 meeting that set the tone for everlasting peace and success for the United States and China. I want to ask you, Henrietta, how do you view this meeting, and to what extent do you view what was achieved at this meeting as relatively permanent or more temporary?
Well, look, I love everlasting peace as much as the next guy, but I'm unfortunately not quite sure that's what we're going to see coming out of this meeting. It seems like both sides were looking for a period of more extended stability in the relationship. And the outcomes of the meeting really focused on unwinding some of the most damaging retaliatory measures that have been brought to bear over the course of the trade war, rather than addressing any of the underlying economic imbalances that the trade war was ostensibly launched to address. So, for example, China committed to resume agricultural purchase U.S. soybeans, for example, though our colleague Phil Luck at CSIS did some great work showing that even the commitment China made is actually much lower than the level of agricultural purchases that China had made in the past, and we don't even know if they'll come through on the commitments they made. China also agreed to pause for 1 year implementation of the most sweeping restrictions they announced on rare earths back in October, though the regulations remain in place. China said that this is for a year, or at least that's the understanding between the two sides. I don't really buy that necessarily. I think that China will refrain from aggressive implementation of those regulations as long as the United States doesn't do anything that irritates China. What they're creating with their rare earth regulatory system, it's not like an on or an off, it's really a dial. China's designing a system where they can put more pressure or less pressure on the United States by leveraging China's choke points on rare earths and rare earth products, depending on the overall state of the bilateral relationship, whether China's looking to get something from the US. As long as, the US behaves, then there shouldn't be too many issues. But even without these regulations, I mean, a lot of US companies are still having trouble getting rare earths because China doesn't want to allow any buyers to stockpile. They want everyone to be constantly dependent on China's goodwill in a way that I just don't think we're going to see kind of total stability over the course of a year. I'll just highlight one other issue that was discussed in the meeting. Trump has been celebrating China's supposed commitment to work with the US to end the fentanyl crisis, to prevent these precursor chemicals from being exported from China that then fuel the opioid crisis in the United States. And so China has sold this deal twice before. This is the third time. President Trump in his first term and President Biden both reached an agreement with Xi to cooperate on counter-narcotics. And I think in both cases, China did come through and do some things. It was never enough, but we saw real steps on law enforcement cooperation, scheduling certain relevant chemicals, that kind of work. So, in a way, we had that too before the trade war started. And I think ultimately the Chinese walked away from this meeting feeling really confident that they have the upper hand in the US-China relationship and that they were able to achieve overall stability. For example, the two sides not only kind of paused in a more indefinite way the very, very high tariff rates that were in play earlier. It was effectively a trade embargo. But Trump also said he's dropping 10 of the 20% tariff that had been associated with fentanyl that was not paused, that had been in effect. So anyway, I think the Chinese are walking away from this meeting, feel like they got what they wanted, they got what they needed on their terms, while giving very little of substance. And so I think going forward, we'll have to deal with the additional risk to regional stability of China just feeling really confident in a way that could actually increase the risk of them underestimating the resolve, certainly of the United States, but of other regional players too, to push back against kind of the most ambitious vision that China would have for its leadership in the region.
You mentioned that China walked away by giving up very little. Do you think the United States gave up a lot or gave up very little too?
Yeah, so it seems like there is an understanding that the US will pause implementation of its own export controls for a year, with specific reference to this like 50% BIS rule that says, if a company's on the entity list, then subsidiaries also are subject to those same export controls, which is a pretty significant thing. Of course, the US also dropped, 10 of the 20% fentanyl tariff and did not return to the very high levels of tariffs we saw in the spring, which were actually scheduled to come back into effect on November 10th if there hadn't been an agreement. So there's what you have formally, and then there's what you have more implicitly. So in the lead up to this meeting, there's been, with exceptions, I think some really significant moments of unilateral restraint in how the US is engaging on China issues. And I think we saw that maybe most prominently in the downgrading of certain elements of the US relationship with Taiwan. And so even though Taiwan wasn't raised, we think, in the meeting, even though there wasn't some grand bargain, in practice, China has been able to wield Trump's interest in just having a nice meeting, a meeting that feels good, to secure preemptive concessions on some pretty important issues, even though that's been a little informal. It's not a black letter agreement. I would also just say, what is the effective tariff rate is kind of a complicated metaphysical question when there's so many overlapping authorities. And so just looking at the number, the effective tariff rate probably came down to something like 47% on China after all of these arrangements shook out in Korea. But a big chunk of that 47% is based on the 301 tariffs from President Trump's first administration that were then recalibrated a little bit during the Biden administration. And so I just checked the Yale Budget Lab numbers. They're saying the effective tariff rate on China right now is 20.2%, with the rest of the world at 17.3%. And so the spread in the tariff rate between China and US allies and partners has closed dramatically. I mean, and in some cases it's lower. Like India still has a 50% tariff. And so one of the most important impacts of the US tariffs on China going back to the first Trump administration was that it created a very significant economic incentive for diversification. And you see a lot of companies adopting this, 1+1 strategy. Like, are they going to totally pull out of China? Not always. But if you're thinking about growth, new investments, and new manufacturing capacity, companies often looked to Vietnam, India, Malaysia. And some of that is insulation against geopolitical risk, but the favorable tariff structure backing those decisions was an important factor. And that's been almost wiped out overnight. And that is a huge win for China as well, as it looks to retain the entire manufacturing chain. As we saw coming out of the fourth plenum quite recently, China's signaling clearly it doesn't just want to move up the value chain. It wants the entire value chain to be in China, controlled by China when it comes to manufacturing across a huge range of sectors. What China's walking away with following this meeting in Korea is really a pretty significant boon for those efforts. And even the symbolism alone of narrowing that spread in the tariff structure between China and then the US traditional friends in the region is a huge win for Beijing.
It seems, Henrietta, that you're implying that China came out of this meeting gaining more than the United States.
I think Trump weights very heavily just the fact that the meeting felt good, that he was able to alleviate challenges that some political constituencies very important to him, like soybean farmers, were facing, even though those were problems that he kind of created by pursuing the US-China relationship in this aggressive way. I tend to think, unfortunately, that the Chinese may be right in feeling like they came out ahead after this meeting, that they are on maybe a stronger footing in the US-China relationship than they've ever been.
Fascinating. Greg, I want to bring you in here. You're obviously watching US-China dynamics very closely, as well as how countries in the region are reacting to this. You mentioned earlier that the fact that Trump met President Xi was viewed as somewhat of a good thing from a Southeast Asia's perspective. Do you have a sense from the region if regional leaders or regional experts also think that China walked away with more, or maybe the United States walked away with more? What is the net assessment from the region, if there is any?
I don't know that there's a coherent region-wide net assessment yet. The biggest takeaway for the region, as Henrietta already alluded to, was that they didn't want to see the trade deal worsen, and they didn't want the U.S. and China to strike some kind of grand bargain to try to establish a condominium, whatever, G2 reference. That's not what they viewed as the outcome. And so they avoided the worst possible outcomes. If we were to look at the op-ed pages of newspapers in places like Singapore, Malaysia right now, I do think you'll see a bit of the narrative that China probably got the better of the United States on this, but that's not universal. It's not shared across the region. There is a fair bit of frustration and anger still being reserved in regional countries for the perception that the U.S. has taken advantage of their leaders. So, for instance, right now, I think in Malaysia, which did release the full text of a trade agreement, there's far more focus on criticizing the Malaysian government for perceptions that the U.S.-Malaysia deal is unfair, and therefore less focus on the details of the U.S.-China deal that came out.
I want to shift to another topic that was mentioned earlier, which Henrietta, you brought up at the very beginning, which is what was not included and not discussed during the Trump-Xi meeting. Prior to the meeting, President Trump had mentioned to his South Korean counterparts that he expected the meeting to last 3 or 4 hours, and the actual meeting was less than 2 hours, I think 1 hour and 40 minutes, which meant a number of items weren't covered. I think, Henrietta, you mentioned Taiwan. Greg, you also mentioned South China Sea. Another topic that wasn't covered was Ukraine-Russia and the potential oil sanctions. Maybe Henrietta first, why do you think some of these topics were not covered? Is it because they wanted this first meeting to be relatively positive, so they shelved some of these more contentious issues, or is it to reserve more topics for Trump's China trip? Or what's your best sense of why some of these topics weren't covered?
It is actually pretty unusual for a sit-down formal summit between the US and China to be that brief, in part because there's often just such an expansive agenda that the two sides need to address due to a very large number of areas of disagreement on which it has been important to address misunderstandings, clarify positions, but then also there has historically been efforts at building a cooperative agenda as well. And just all that takes a lot of time. And of course, there's translation as well. So it was a brief meeting. But on the Russia file, Trump walked out of the meeting saying that China will help end the war with Ukraine, and the US and China are going to work together to end the war. And unfortunately, I feel that may be a little optimistic. China is a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine, of the Russian war machine. Without Chinese financial support to evade sanctions, without Chinese economic support to backfill trade with the US and Europe, without the dual use inputs that China's providing to the Russian defense industrial base at a systematic scale that allows Russia to regenerate its forces after taking battlefield losses. Without all of that, the Russians could not continue the war in Ukraine. So China's support is not some small thing. I mean, it's really a decisive enabler of Russia's ability to continue fighting. And so if Trump wants China to make a difference towards bringing peace in Ukraine, I mean, what he would need to do is threaten credible financial sanctions, probably on the Chinese banks responsible for facilitating these transactions that are supporting the Russian war machine, and to say, look, you have to stop supporting this war because the war needs to end. And if you don't do that, there will be consequences for important elements of the Chinese financial system. Maybe not the largest banks, but he should have a credible threat there. And the US does already have authorities on the books to take that kind of action. But I'm sure that's not what Trump did. I think his primary objective of having a nice meeting, building a warm relationship with Xi, he wasn't going to be in a position to make those kind of threats that could actually move China's position, at least to some degree, on the Russia issue. But maybe just one last thought on your question. Ultimately, is the reason that Trump didn't spend more time on strategic issues, on the really important areas of difference between the US and China in how we view the regional order, in how we view issues like Taiwan, like the South China Sea, was that not raised because Trump ran out of time? Like, honestly, I wouldn't assume that, because we've seen Trump be very interested in engaging with Xi personally on some of these parochial economic issues, tactical economic issues. Soybeans, for example, he's posted on social media about a few times. We haven't really seen a similar level of focus on the hard parts of the relationship that bear on kind of strategic security considerations or, let alone values.
Thank you, Henrietta. I do think, to your point about the issues that President Trump wants to cover, he is very focused on the economic front. Though I'm not sure trying to work on US-China economic ties is necessarily that much easier than security front. But to your point, it's very clear that a lot of security issues aren't mentioned.
So you're completely right that the economic agenda is very difficult in the US-China relationship, in part because, China has been doubling down on a model of growth based on massive industrial overcapacity that's then exported to markets around the world in a way that can easily wipe out huge swaths of the manufacturing sectors, not just in the US, but we're seeing this increasingly in Europe and Southeast Asia and the global South. So the non-market policies and practices that have been baked into the Chinese model of growth are totally unsustainable for the rest of the world. And so this is supposed to be kind of the reason we're in a trade war, because these underlying economic imbalances are so damaging to the US that China has to be convinced to make changes. But those aren't the issues that Trump seems to be discussing. Those aren't the issues that his trade negotiators or Secretary Bessent seem to be discussing. It seems like quite rapidly after kind of the re-energizing of the trade war earlier this year with China, from the moment that China weaponized its choke points on rare earth and rare earth products. And of course, those rare earth products are so critical for US manufacturing, the defense industrial base, auto manufacturing, so much of the modern economy. Once China weaponized those choke points effectively, the negotiations and even the retaliation around the trade war really degenerated into a management of retaliation and the fallout of the trade war itself, rather than underlying economic imbalances. And so I hope that now that the relationship is on a stronger footing, we can see the US refocus on the non-market policies and practices that have done so much damage to American workers and American industry.
I do want to wrap up by asking the two of you to look ahead in the next couple of months. What are you watching or looking out for when it comes to either China's relations or activities in Southeast Asia with ASEAN countries or with US-China relations? Maybe Henrietta first, and then we'll conclude with Greg.
As I mentioned earlier, my expectation is that a lot of these concessions we saw from China, buying agricultural products, pausing rare earth export control implementation. I think that is highly contingent on China feeling satisfied with the overall state of the US-China relationship. So it will be interesting to see how implementation plays out over the coming weeks. And it'll be interesting to see, are US companies getting the rare earths they need? And when and in what amount? Because I don't think we should take for granted that China's just turned off these rare earth export controls, for example, in part because the regulations they announced regarding rare earth controls back in the spring are even still in effect. So just how they calibrate that dial over the next few months, especially going into what we expect will be President Trump's trip to China early next year, will be really interesting to watch.
Thank you, Greg.
One of the other reasons I think we shouldn't be at all surprised that the meeting between President Trump and President Xi went so short was because the groundwork had been done quite out in the open. Secretary Bessent and Li Changgang, along with Greer and He Lifeng, were meeting in Kuala Lumpur to hash out the details, at least the contours of this ceasefire, while President Trump was there for the meetings on the sidelines of ASEAN. There was no complimentary negotiations on anything else. And so for China, given how much we know that the Chinese leadership does not want to see Donald Trump's kind of capacity to ad lib and make trouble, they were very nervous about having this meeting. There was no incentive, I think, for Xi Jinping or the Chinese leadership to go beyond what they had just extracted in Besant and Li Changang's meeting just a few days earlier. And the U.S. side, I'm sure, very quickly realized that they were not going to get any other concessions. And so it was an hour and a half, the job of which was basically to rubber stamp the agreement that both sides had gotten their cabinet to negotiate a few days earlier and then get out of there without things going wrong. I will be watching the South China Sea, as we always are. There has been a lot going on around Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal. I think we are still in the middle of an escalatory cycle between Beijing and Manila. These things usually de-escalate relatively quickly. This one has not. We've been seeing tensions stay persistently high since July, when the Chinese Navy frigate collided with a China Coast Guard vessel, probably killing 2 Chinese sailors. And China has retaliated with a number of steps, including deploying uncrewed buoys and a permanent barrier at Scarborough Shoal and declaring the shoal a marine park, which has, again, provoked counter-reactions from the Philippines, and now these new developments that Secretary Hegseth highlighted during his trip to Kuala Lumpur. So what exactly do we see as a result of this new Task Force Philippines? What's contained in this new alliance action plan that Secretary Hegseth and Philippines Secretary Teodoro also highlighted? We're seeing a whole bevy of what the Philippines calls maritime cooperation activities. These are multilateral patrols in disputed waters. The most recent one was a multi-part that involved the Canadians and I believe the Australians and the Americans. And just today, the Philippines, or overnight, while we're recording, which I'll note is the beginning of November, we had the conclusion of a Canadian-Philippine Visiting Forces Agreement. So there's a lot of mill activity happening on that front, and I'm not sure I see evidence that either Manila or Beijing are prepared to de-escalate, which means that we could wake up on any day and find out that there was another accidental collision.
And Greg, just to follow up on that, because you raised very important dynamics that we should have covered a bit earlier in the podcast. From your perspective, does this represent a change in approach that China is taking towards Manila or the South China Sea under President Trump? Or do you think we're seeing this sustained tensions because of all the activities converging both on the Chinese side and the U.S. side, as well as the Philippine side?
This seems to be the continuation of a pattern that's been underway for several years, at least the last 4 or 5 years, in which China has steadily ratcheted up the non-lethal pressure, the quote gray zone stuff, the use of water cannons and intentional collisions, or the creation of risk of collision. The Philippines has refused to back down. I mean, more quietly, other states have as well, Vietnam, Malaysia, and that leads to more frequent accidental collisions, injuries, and in the case of the July incident, for the first time in decades, deaths. I don't see that anything has really changed in China's approach, and I don't see that anything has changed in the U.S. approach. As we indicated earlier, the South China Sea has been one of those issues that has really remained unchanged. Everything that Secretary Rubio and Secretary Hegseth say about it and everything that Indo-PACOM is doing are continuations of Biden administration policy. But that pattern was moving in a worrying direction, and so it continuing to do so should keep us worried.
Thank you, Greg, for flagging that near the end of the podcast. I think it's really important for folks to continue to pay attention to developments in the South China Sea, despite what might be happening elsewhere. And despite, as what Henrietta points out, some of the meetings may be for external show than actually necessarily making progress on concrete items. So thank you very much, Henrietta and Greg, for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.